Hello everyone, this is DesTr0, and today I have something a little bit different than usual. I am making a coding tutorial, which is not something that I've done before, and not something that I plan on doing again, unless I have to, or there's something I want to share. So the reason I am doing this today is because over the last 9 months, um, I have become familiar with the .NET MVC framework, and I wanted to share some information that I've learned that could help students taking like the web programming 5 course and potentially like in their development course, which is where I've most recently had to solve this issue that I'm going to be covering today. So I wanted to talk about something that's not really been explicitly taught in school. So we were given basic knowledge of the .NET framework and how to do simple CRUD, but then we were asked to build a more complex application which goes beyond that, in which we have to create multiple objects within a single form, and we're not really told how to do that. And I felt like documentation online was not super in-depth. And so I've had to figure out a lot of these issues myself. And I think I have a pretty good formula now that you should be able to apply to a lot of situations. And I'm trying to offer the tools today to be able to create something like this for your own projects. So I'm showing this example here in the context of the application that my team is building in development project, like I said. So this application is still a work in progress, but this part is functional so far. And so I'm re-recording this intro after having recorded the tutorial, and my webcam is in the top right for this first part, but then it'll be in the bottom left, just because I realized that I was hiding this button all throughout. I mean, I realized at some point through the recording, and then sometimes I hide my webcam to show when I'm clicking this button. But then that brought up another issue where when I'm hiding my webcam, I'm also not recording my mic. So I kind of missed that. And so I have had to voice over those sections where I hide my webcam. Thankfully, there's not too many of them, but I'm not sure if I missed something important that I said. Hopefully I didn't. Yeah, anyway. So, as per the title, what I'm trying to show you guys how to do today is how to create multiple objects from a single form using JavaScript and .NET MVC. Because it's very frequent in .NET that you have to do, CRUD operations. So you have to create a new object and then maybe update it, delete it, blah, blah, blah. That can be very easily done with scaffolding in Entity Framework. You can just ask the code to generate a create page where, based on the class that you give it, it'll take all of the attributes of that class and make fields for them. So it's super simple, very, very easy to use. That's not what I'm talking about today. Today I'm talking about a case where you want to create multiple objects in a single form. So you have like an I collection. I mean, we'll be looking at the classes later. So in this case, this is an application that I'm building for the school, or that we are building for the school, that lets us, well, I'm just going to talk about this component here. It's about adding competencies to the application, which competencies are targets that every college course has to achieve, or it has to address them in the course through like labs and assignments and stuff. And so competencies are sent out by the ministry to all the colleges for like a single program. And a competency has multiple elements, which like at least 3 it seems, and up to around 9 from what I've seen so far. So there's 2 ways you can kind of add these elements to your database. Well, more than 2 ways, but I'll just say 2 for now. The first approach would be to create all of those elements individually. So you can have a page that lets you add an element, and an element is just a title and performance criteria. You don't have to know what this means for this tutorial. It's not super important. But it's just we have 2 fields per element. So then you can have a page where you add 1 element at a time. And then you would also need an option, like a drop down, to be able to link an element to a specific competency that you had created before. And that would work. But imagine that, the ministry sends out a document for a program, and it has like 20 competencies, and those competencies have on average 5 elements or something. So that's 100 elements that you would need to add individually to your application. So 100 times you go on that page and you submit a form, but then you need to have added your competencies first so that you can link the elements to them properly. And I think you can see how that would be extremely inconvenient for any user of your application, even if it would function, So what we instead want to do is be able to have all of that information on one page, which is what we have here. So we start off with 1 element, and then we can click this button here to add more. And if we need to, we can remove them. We can't remove the first element, so I've instead made it so you can empty it. So it just makes those 2 fields empty. And on the server, when we submit the form by hitting this button here, it'll actually create all of the objects in a single go, like you would expect. And if there's an error, we can load the page again and have all of these fields be filled out like we had submitted them. And something else that was important for this was that, so we have like data annotations on the element class to indicate like which fields are required. So in this case, both of these fields are required. And we also have like a maximum length, and then we also have a display name. So we want to make sure that every field that we add respects all of that and enforces validation. So here I've only partially filled these fields, and when I try to submit, it'll say that they're required. And so this field was added dynamically, but it still follows our data annotations and our validation. So that was another goal with this, because that was another problem that I had to solve. And yeah, so I have a sort of agenda of what I'll be covering today. I talk about a lot of things, and it's a pretty in-depth tutorial. So, I mean, you can kind of skip ahead to something you might be more interested in. However, you might miss some important parts, so I wouldn't recommend skipping. But if you already know how to do this, but you might be missing one part, then yeah, sure. And I'll also put chapters on the YouTube video so you can know which section you're in, etc., etc. So first, we'll talk about how to set up your C# classes, and we'll be going over also some tricks in Visual Studio related to C#, just about like some common stuff and documentation, things like that. Then we'll be taking a look at how to set up your JavaScript files for a larger project where you might want to reuse some of your code in multiple files. I also want to show off some useful functions that could apply to most JavaScript projects that I've been using for a while now. And I'll also be showing some other tricks related to documentation and commenting and things like that. Then the first step to this is being able to post a single object, so a single element, and then be able to load the page again in case there was an error. So, because I had some issues with the approach I did that I had to solve, so I'll be walking through how I got this to work. Then we'll actually do adding the new field to the page. Then a very important step of this is keeping everything numbered properly, which includes also attributes in the HTML. That's super important. So we're going to be taking a lot of time to look at that and how I did it. So it'll always stay numbered properly. Then after that, we'll be looking at how to remove fields from the page. That's very simple once you can renumber everything properly. Then we'll look at how to apply the validations to the new fields that we create. And then so something else that I did for this is that if you look at this, these two pairs or these two elements are completely empty, so they have no title and no performance criteria. So if we try to submit this, it would just say that the title is required and the performance criteria is required. So this, it would just give errors. So instead what I've done is when you try to submit, it'll clear any empty elements because they would just give errors, so there's no point in keeping them unless the user had actually written something in them. So I'll just be quickly going over how to do that. And the final part is related to more C# things. I talk about how to do some custom validation using the square brackets, the decorators, and how to do that validation on arrays and how to do that. So that part's not really complicated. It's a small thing, but it's something that I did for this and that I think might be useful. Okay, so I think that is everything that I wanted to talk about in this intro. I've already been talking for a while, so let's get to it. I will meet you guys in the bottom left. Okay, so the first step in solving this problem is how you create, first of all, multiple objects from a single form. So in MVC.NET, it is very frequent that you have to create an object from a form. That's not complicated. You can scaffold that, and just based on the fields of the class that you want to create, it'll just give you those fields, whether it's a number input, a text input, etc., etc. And then the object gets created when you post it on the server. That is very standard. It's not complicated, but something that was not taught in school really to me. I don't know if that's changed now, but is how you create multiple objects from a single form. So we have this iCollection here, and an iCollection is a generic interface, which is fine for keeping it as part of the class itself, but so that's what you get when you scaffold in an entity framework, when you do database first. However, the issue with an iCollection is that you can't index an iCollection with the array indexer, so like the square brackets, which we will kind of need to do later when we want to tell, like in our page, we want to be able to tell .NET, this is the object 0 of my collection that I'm creating here. This is object 1. So instead, we want an array, and so this is why I have another attribute of my competency class here related to elements. So these are the regular elements, and then here I have elements to add. So I've called it that way because it's just the elements that I'm going to be adding in the page. And instead of being an iCollection, it is an array of type element. So same thing as before. However, this one is not mapped. So if you're unaware of this property, not mapped just means that there's no attribute for elements to add, or there's no foreign key relationship to elements to add in our database. So you can add like any attribute you want, really. I can say int my prop, and I don't think this would compile. Actually, let me just see if it'll compile or not, because it might complain that the competency table does not have a property of my prop. So I just want to see if this will even compile. Okay, it compiles. Okay, looks fine. Okay, but you could have some issues to where it expects there to be a my prop in your database, but there isn't, and so in that case, you can just add the not mapped property. But just to be safe, I've added it here, though maybe it's not required. And this maximum elements, we'll get back to it later. We don't really need it right now, but it's just because you don't want the users to be able to add an infinite number of elements to to a competency. So this is just a value here, 20. I'll make it lower for for testing purposes as we're going along, because we're going to be using this to limit the number of elements the user can add in the page. This is mostly an arbitrary value. Okay, so now we have an array of elements. And an array, as I said, is something that we can index, and so this will be helpful to us. Now let's move on to the view code. The view for now, let me just show you guys what we're starting with. It's mostly the same page. We just have one field for one element as the default. And so this is what we're going to be working on. But this button doesn't do anything. The rest is the same. So that's what we're going to be filling up here. Let me... Oh, first, yeah, I just wanted to talk about the data annotations that I've added so far, other than the custom validation. So for the competency itself, we have Clara program ID. That's from the dropdown. So we're making sure that we've selected a program. We can look at the custom validation later. But basically everything is required and just has a max length and a display. Pretty simple. And then for elements themselves, elements will also be using their attributes and display values and data annotations. So we'll look at them. They just have a display, a required, and a max length as well. So the element class just has element ID, competency ID, a title and performance criteria, and a description, which we're not using. And that's about it for this class. So okay, what's the first step here to add elements to the page? So we'll be doing a lot of JavaScript in this, and I prefer to do my JavaScript in VS Code, so that's what I'll be looking at. Okay, this is a starting point. Actually, before we really dive into the JavaScript, I wanted to explain how you can set up your JavaScript for your project if it's spread across multiple files, but you might want to have certain functions which are shared between your files, which by default can't really be done in JavaScript, as far as I'm aware, unless you do this method here with exports. So in our layout for the application, we have a script, site.js. That's very typical. However, what is different here is that it is of type module. Because site.js, what it has, sorry, if I bring it up here in VS Code, site.js, so it has just some functions that you might want to use on every page. We don't need to look at these. That's not the point. But it has imports for all of these methods from utilities.js. So what's utilities.js? It's another JavaScript file that we have for our utility functions that we want shared across all our JavaScript files. So I just want to talk quickly about some of them. Because I think they are like general purpose functions that you might find useful in your own projects. So we have QSA and QS, which stand for Query Selector All and Query Selector. So let's take a look at Query Selector. So the basic, Query Selector function is very long. Like you have to write all of this just to be able to make your selection. So instead, QS is something very short, but it behaves the exact same way. You pass it your selector, which is a string, and then where it becomes different is that it has a second optional parameter of the parent on which you want to do your selection. So the way Query Selector works, in case you're unaware, is it'll query the children of the parent on which you execute the function. So when you do document.querySelector, it'll look at every node in the page because every node or every element is a descendant of the document. However, if I do let header, equals document.querySelector header, and then I do let children equals header dot query, I'll do query selector all, whatever, and then I just query all nodes within the header, I will only get the children of the header itself, not everything in the page. So yeah, query selector and query selector all are limited to the parent on which you call the method from, because every element can call a query selector. So this is what we're doing here. First of all, we check if there's no selector pass, and if there's no parent, return null. So if this is null, or if it's an empty string or whatever, it'll just return null. And then we are returning parent.querySelector. So we're calling query selector on the parent, which by default is the document if you don't pass anything. And then we pass it a string of the query selector. And now, you might be wondering what all of this is and what all of this is. Well, this is simply documentation comments in JavaScript, which I find very useful here because you can give the type of your parameters. And the reason why you might want to do that is because by default, if you make a function in JavaScript, since it's not a typed language, like variables by default are just of type any, right? Which isn't super useful because you get no IntelliSense when your variable is of type any. So if I say param1, and then let's say in my mind param1 is a string, and then I do param1, and then I want to call the substring method. I have to call the substring method, but this method is not recognized or anything because my parameter is of type any. So here's how you do documentation comments in JavaScript in VS Code. So you do /**, enter, and then for every parameter that you have, it'll give you one of these lines, a param. So the star, this here is the type of your parameter. Star just means any. But if we want to say that this is a string, then here we can give a description for this param string. And then if you hover over this method, it tells you a description of what this parameter is. It tells you this is a string, and it returns void because we don't have a return statement in this. And now it recognizes our substring method because it knows that our parameter is of type string, or it's expected to be of type string. Obviously, it's JavaScript, so you can pass anything to this, and it'll still run. It might throw an error in the console or whatever, but I think that it can help your project stay organized, and also you gain IntelliSense by telling basically the code what you expect your parameters to be. But now, what is this? So this is actually a type of casting in JavaScript, which is not naturally supported. This is, I don't know the full specifications of this, but as you can tell, this is a comment, right? But it's a comment that once again indicates tells the code what type you expect this to be. Because by default, query selector returns it does return an HTML element or null, so we don't really need to do this cast. Actually, this one's not the best, but I just cast it to HTML element. But in query selector all here, which is basically the same method, something special that we do is the result of our query selector all is a node list of element, which is not an array, but usually you want to work with an array in JavaScript because you get some nice methods like slice, push, shift, all that. So what we do is we turn it into an array by, I don't remember what this operation is called, but 3 dots operation on a list of elements into an array. That's what the square brackets are. We're basically turning this node list of elements into an array, and then to make sure that we get the right result, we cast it to a type of HTML element array. Boom. Okay. So I'm spending a lot of time here at the beginning, but I just want to explain some of these things that I've learned that you might find useful for your own projects. Now keep in mind that all of these functions are exported, which is how we're able to use them in other files, such as site.js, which imports these. But in order to have access to exports and imports, that's why you have to say this type of module here, because the type of module for JavaScript files is what allows you to do exports and imports. And I think that naturally, like there's no link to the utilities.js file, but since site.js imports things from utilities.js, it'll also get queried automatically, or it'll get linked automatically, so you don't have to worry about that. And yeah, so that's QSA. I think functions like that are very useful because they're much faster to write. Like in what is it, jQuery, they use $, but $, to me is kind of meaningless. QS tells you what it actually is in QSA. It's like, oh, okay, query selector all. Okay, I know that. So I just find that better naming. And there is another method that I want to show you guys. Find nearest parent of type. So have you ever found yourself in a situation where like the user clicks on something in the page and you want to find the nearest div that is a parent of whatever element they clicked on? So if you have like a span inside a header, inside an article, inside a div, you want to be able to get that div from any of those children that you can click. So you can click on the span or the article or the header, and you always want to be able to find that parent div. So this is the method I came up with to do that. Find nearest parent of type, where the type is the node type, such as like button, div, p for paragraph, etc., etc. So you pass it the element from which like you start your search. So you can imagine like this function just basically bubbles up. So the element is the starting element, and then the parent tag name is, yeah, like I said, div, or etc., etc. If anything is empty or null or whatever, we return null. If our starting element does not have a parent, we return null as well. And then we set the parent tag name to lowercase. And then we just do a while loop here. As long as we haven't found an element whose tag name is the same as the parameter that we passed, we just reassign our element to the parent element. So this is the bubbling, basically. We just get the parent of the parent, and then so on and so forth, until we reach either the tag name of HTML, which is the root node of everything, or if there is no parent in our current node, HTML, because the HTML node does not have a parent, I believe. So if either of these happens, then we've reached the root node, at which point we exit out of the loop because of this clause. And then if we have reached the root node, then we won't go into this if, we'll return null. But if we haven't reached it, then we return whatever elements we were at in our loop before exiting. Because this clause made us exit the loop because we had found an element that matches the tag name that we were looking for. Okay, cool. So there's other methods here that we'll be looking at. Actually, there is a quick one I can do. Resize text area. Let me show you guys in the page. This is a very nice effect that I think is useful to have in most cases. It's just when you press, whoops. Oh, sorry, this is the incomplete one. Shoot. Wait, actually. Hold up. Let me reattach my console here. Oh, couldn't add an event listener. Okay, that's not good. Okay, sorry, I figured it out. There were some errors in the console, but that wasn't the issue. The issue was with the user. That's me. So I have this function to resize text areas as you type in them, so that you always see whatever text you type. So if I keep typing here, it'll expand as is needed. So I think that's very useful. The issue, or the reason why it wasn't working here, is because the title is not supposed to have any line breaks in it. So there's another function that removes any line breaks from this text area, or more specifically, it removes line breaks from text areas that have the attribute of remove line breaks equals true. So I completely forgot about that. It's been like a while since I've touched this code base, just a month, but yeah, So that was a reason. Anyway, so let me show you guys this method here. I've added it. Whoops. Wait, which one do I want? Sorry, starting point. Okay, yeah. I've added this method to be globally active on all text areas because I don't really see a scenario where you don't want to have a text area be resized, but you could, of course, make it more specific if you have to. I guess something I should explain before we look at that method. No. Okay, let's look at it now. Whatever. I'm all over the place. Sorry. Not used to coding tutorials. Resize text area. Very simple. It takes an element, which is the text area to resize. So that's an HTML text area element. And then we start by resetting its height style. So this is kind of like inline CSS, but I mean, it works. So that's like the way to do it. I don't really care. So we set its style height to be its scroll height plus 5. This plus 5 is only so that the scroll bar doesn't appear. I think that without it, a scroll bar would appear. I can show you guys that to be the case. So if I remove it, and then we're setting it in pixels. So I've removed that. Now if I do this, yeah, you can see the scroll bar appears, but it's like I can't move the scroll bar very much. So instead of showing that ugly thing, I just do plus 5 pixels. Not even sure if that works on all browsers, but yeah, you'd have to do some testing. Anyway, so this is that method. Very simple. And there's also a resize text areas, which resizes all text areas on screen. We just get all the text areas, and if we were able to query more than one, then we do a for each where we resize every text area individually. Awesome. Now, I want to talk about how I handle my events because it'll come into play later. More specifically in competency.js, which is the page, which is the JavaScript file we're going to be working on. I already have the main event handler set up. So when the window loads, we take the body of the page, and then we add like a click event handler to it, and then it calls this handle click method. So I prefer adding my event listeners to the body and then handling each scenario from a central place. You could add a lot of event listeners, but I kind of tend to stay away from doing that. I think this is fairly scalable, I don't know what the best way to do it is, but I know that this works fairly well. And since the JavaScript files are separate for like the main pages, your main click handlers, like your central functions, don't get too out of control. Um, so this is what we have here. Basically, we start by getting the target of the event, which is a pointer event. And then if we do have a target, then based on that target's properties, we might call some other methods. So here we check the ID, and if the ID is this, we'll do this and all of that. So I'm calling these methods right now. They don't exist. This file is empty. We'll be filling it up as we go. But I just wanted to explain how I handle my events. It's not the best way to do it. It is a way to do it, but it's how I'm going to be doing it for this tutorial. Okay, I guess we should get started now, shall we? So let me clear the console. We don't need this garbage. So the first thing that we will want is so that when we click on add element, we get a new element added to the page. Okay, awesome. So there's two main ways you can do this. Not two main ways. What I used to do in the past, or what I did for the HVK project, which you guys might be watching this video because you're working on that project. What I did is that my JavaScript would just add inner HTML, and then I would just, I would give it, what do I have here? I would give it the labels, these fields, and then the button. And I would just have that in my JavaScript as an inner HTML, and I would just do plus equals to my div that contains these elements. So which one is it? The elements container. So I would just add one element div row. I would just do a plus equals to my inner HTML. However, the issue with doing it that way, I mean, this works. That will work for sure. But now your issue is that you have HTML code, we'll call it code, but you have HTML in both your main project, in your view. So this is the code of the view, right? So we have the elements container here, and then our element with the labels and the inputs. So now you would have that duplicated in this file and in your JavaScript. So if you want to make a change, you have to do it in two places, which is obviously not ideal. You want to remove duplication as much as possible. So the strategy I've started using is to, in fact, duplicate code, but I duplicate it in the view itself. So let me just check my endpoint here to get the code that I want. Here it is. I think I can add it anywhere really. Let's add it here. So we have this div here with another label, a text area. So this is the same as this, basically the exact same thing. But this one is contained within a div with the ID of element div to copy and a class of dNone, which is a bootstrap class, stands for display none, which means this will be hidden in the page. So the idea is we keep our view code in the view, and we only give the knowledge to our JavaScript of where to find the element that we want to copy and paste again in the page. So the JavaScript just knows how to do that. It doesn't know what the actual view code is, so you can modify this. So I mean, if I have to modify the look of this, I modify it here, and I modify it here. So it's only two places. It's not too bad. You could be maybe even more efficient and do a partial view, or maybe that's not the best use of a partial view, but you could make this more efficient if you really wanted. But yeah, I guess, okay, so for this tutorial, I am using ASP4s. I'm not using HTML tag helpers because I don't really know them or remember them. And I think that ASP tag helpers are just better in general. However, I did have to use an HTML display name for in a case here. So as you saw on the page, for every element, we have a number in front of it. So that you can keep track of how many elements you've added. But we still want to have the data annotation of the display name of our element here. So element has the display of title. We want to keep all this display information in the class itself using data annotations because you want to have a central source of your information. It's usually just better to do it that way. But since we need to have that number in there, the way I did that is just to have, we start with a hard-coded one, but we'll have JavaScript so that the subsequent elements increase that number. So you have the number, and then display name for. This is kind of weird. Model, but we're not using the model here. We just want an element for displaying .title. This is kind of a weird hacky workaround. Basically, I just make an empty element, and I use that just to get its title display name property. I mean, that works. I think the reason I did that was because I didn't want to have, or no, what was it? It's because when we first load the page, we won't have any elements to add because our model is null, right? When you first load the page. So there's not going to be any elements. And so if you try to do, I think it was like if you try to do display name for on a null element, it would throw an exception. I don't exactly remember. But this works. That's what I'm doing. I don't really care. But for everything else, we're using ASP4s. And now here's how you tell MVC which element you are creating from your array. It's very simple. It's just using your array indexer. This is why we needed to make that elements to add property, because we need to index it. And so the rules for indexing are pretty simple, but it'll cause some issues that we have to solve later. So first rule is, you must start at 0, and then every number must be covered sequentially. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., etc. You can't have any gaps. So you can't have 0, 1, 2, 5, 6. That, what will happen is, I believe it will create an array, it will create the biggest legal array that it can. So if you had 0, 1, 2, 5, 6, it'll create an array of 3 elements, whatever you had for element 0, 1, and 2. And they must appear in order in the page. So element 0 must be first in the page, and then element 1, and then element 2. I believe that's true. I believe you can't have it in any order you want, but if you have all the numbers, it'll create it in the correct order. Not entirely sure, but I mean, in general, you should have it in order. I don't see why you wouldn't. And yeah, so elements to add is an array of elements, and then so when we index it, that gives us one element, and so this is specifically for the title. And then same thing, then this is our input, and then this is our validation for it. Pretty simple. And then we have this duplicated down here. Now, we have a max elements attribute, which is just a custom HTML attribute. You can do that as is needed, which has a value of maximum elements. This is just a variable that takes the value of the constant from earlier. We set it to 6 now. I just set it in the variable because it's much shorter to write this than this a lot of times, because we do have to write it multiple times. So yeah, we're setting this into the page so that when we try to add new elements, it'll check if you went over the maximum. and if you are equal to the maximum, then you can't add more elements. So, okay, this is going to be a bit weird to explain. What we want is to have. Okay, actually, let me show you guys the page for this part. This is one of the things that gave me the most trouble since I started doing the method where you have the HTML in the view and then you copy it from the view. You didn't really have that issue with JavaScript. So wait, let me go in the inspector here. Let's give it more space. I don't want this garbage. Give me. Why does it appear there? I don't want this. Anyway, I'm a professional, guys. Don't worry. So we have. Let's look at this input here. And this label. This is good. In the code, in the actual code, right? We're using square brackets here, and we're using 0. Okay, perfect. This gets replaced when compiled and sent to the browser. Like for some reason you can't use square brackets. I don't exactly remember the reason when. I don't know if I knew it at some point, but it gets replaced with underscores. And you can notice here that a period as well, since we had dot title, now it's replaced with an underscore as well. This is true, but it's not true for the name. The name keeps the square brackets. So I'm not really sure what's going on here, but the ID and the label like 4 are changed. But so that wasn't really the problem. It's just something to keep in mind. The issue is with this here. So let's look at this div that we've added, which is here. So it has a lot of nested divs. Okay. All right, cool. So it has it has 2 labels and 2 text areas. Our value here is 6, which is expected, because the max elements. Max num elements is 6, so the value here is 6. That makes sense. But when we're going to be posting this array to the page, like if there's an error, right? We want to reload the page with whatever data they had sent. We want to put it back in the page and display any errors that they have. So most errors can be caught on the client side with the data annotations. So all the fields are required, etc., etc. However, we also force the user to have a program selected, and that can only be detected on the server, really. I mean, you could do it with JavaScript, but I decided that I would just let the server handle that. So we have to be able to handle the case where we load the page for the first time, where our model is null, and also we have to be able to handle the case where we reload the page, and now we do have an array of elements to add, which is whatever we had sent. And now our array might be of size 1. So actually, let me submit this and see what happens. But I'll leave this empty, so I'll throw an error. Let's try to call a method. Let's just ignore this for now. Because I want to do this. Yeah. Okay. Shoot. I'm stupid. I'm stupid. Sorry. This isn't gonna take a long time. I just made a change earlier, setting up this presentation. So our create method in the controller is not super complicated. We're just checking the valid state, whether our model state is valid or not. But now let me make it wrong. for the sake of this. Hopefully this crashes. Okay, awesome. So this is something a bit weird. I don't even know how this works truly, but when we first load the page, we do not have an array, right? Because our model is null. So we don't have elements to add, right? And we can look at the code here. We're not creating this array or anything. And yet the code is able to index to the array at position 6 or whatever. It's able to do that. But since that element doesn't exist, like there's no elements to add at position 6 that has a title, because there's no elements to add in the first place. So I guess if this is null, it just assumes that you haven't submitted anything yet, and it's able to create the page. However, as we just saw, when we submit this, so what's happening is we submit this to the server, our model state is incorrect because we have not selected a program, and so it sends the competency back to the page, and it tries to load the page again. However, it crashes because the index was outside the bounds of the array. So can I put a breakpoint here somewhere? That'd be useful to see. Okay, so let's reload the page. Can I see anything? Oh, model. Okay, sorry, I'm literally hiding this. Okay, so we have our model here with elements to add, which is an array of size 1. So before, when we loaded this page, the model was null. Now it actually exists, and there is an elements to add array. However, it is only of size 1 because we only posted one object, and so we get this error. Okay, how do we solve this? This isn't my cleanest code, and frankly, it might seem a bit weird, but it is very much necessary. I want the endpoint. Our goal here is simply going to be to make sure that whenever we load the page, we have an elements to add array of size of the maximum size that we allow, which in this case is 6. And we want to make sure as well that this array is filled with elements that do exist. It's not just filled with null elements. We want real elements. So this is the code here. We check if our model is not equal to null, which means we posted something to the page and then we received it back because there was an error. If the model elements to add was not null, then we start by making a copy of the elements. What's the reason? Okay, okay. So we start by making a copy. Then we override whatever elements we had by recreating a new array of the maximum size allowed plus 1. And the reason we need that plus 1 is, if you remember here, we are indexing at the position max num elements, which is position 6. But since arrays are 0 based, you get the following problem. If your maximum number of elements is 6, then the indices that you will take is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for 6 indices in total. But we're indexing at position 6, which is the 7th element. So when we recreate this array here, we basically want it to be the perfect size so that it can accommodate every element that we could have added, which is a maximum of 6. And we also want it to be able to reach that final index, because if you remember the exception we got, it was an index out of bounds exception, because we were accessing this the 7th position of our array of size 1. So with that plus 1, we will be able to index all the way up to position 6, which is the 7th element of the array, which is this one here. Okay, I hope that made sense. And so now the result of this is that we will have an array, elements to add, of the appropriate size so that it can be indexed properly by the page when trying to create it, and we won't get that exception. Okay, but now we've made this copy of the elements here, and we're not using it for anything. So, okay, cool. What we'll be doing is we will be looping through the max, like from 0 to the maximum number of elements plus 1. Why was that plus 1 needed? I don't exactly remember. Oh, because it's a less than, I guess is why. Because we could be looping up to... Oh, yeah, because I did less than. But I could have done less than equal and removed the plus 1. Okay. So if our current index, if I is less than the copy of elements.length, what that means is a copy of elements is the elements that were posted in the page by the user. So if they posted one element, then copy of elements.length will just be 1. So if I is less than 1, then we set in our elements. Okay, so elements to add was recreated to be an element array, but at this point it's empty. So we set the current element to be the element that we had posted. So what this loop does is it basically copies over every element that we had back into the models, into the elements to add, which has been recreated as a new array of the max size plus 1. And if there wasn't an element posted at this index, so in our example we only posted one element. So what about elements 2, 3, 4, 5, right? We still want to have something in that position in the array. So we just set a new element with an empty title and empty performance criteria. Okay, and if at this point, actually this if is completely useless. If model.elements to add.any, yes, that will always be true. I should fix that. Elements already added, true. That means that we are reloading the page after elements had already been added, and we'll be using that later. And at this point, we want to make sure that I guess actually this is not needed anymore as well. I guess this whole if is not needed. The idea was just to take a portion of the array, so that you couldn't have more than the maximum allowed. So if somehow you had posted 20 elements and our maximum is 6, we only take the first 6 and we only keep those. Though I don't think this is needed because our loop should cover that. It's fine, I'll keep it in, but it's probably not necessary. Okay, and now with this, what this gives us is just the ability to post, for now, one element and make sure that we can load the page again without crashing. And the reason we have to do this is just because we want to have a hidden element that we can copy and add to the page so that we're not duplicating code in our JavaScript. So I hope that all makes sense. So we can post this, and we will be brought back to the page, hopefully. Program must be selected. Awesome. And so it worked. And now we can move on to the next part, which is actually adding the element using JavaScript. All right, I was editing the video, and then I realized that I forgot to mention something, which is good to know, but it doesn't really affect the tutorial that much. But you might be wondering how we can have a copy of our inputs here with the data annotations. So, like this text area is technically required, because elements to add or elements individually need to have a title and performance criteria in order to be submitted, and otherwise you get an error in your page. So I mean, even though these divs are hidden, they are still like part of the page. But the reason why this works is that they are not part of the form itself. So the form ends here, and this div is outside of the form, which is why we can have this on the page and it won't affect us being able to submit the form. So maybe you could encounter an issue if you had this inside your form itself. That might give you some trouble because you'll have invisible fields that have errors in them, so they can't be submitted. So just keep that in mind when making your own page if you do the method of copying fields in the page. Yeah, that's something I wanted to add. So this is kind of awkward. I've been recording this in like multiple parts, and I just like rewatched the previous part, and I just noticed that you guys can't see the button here, which is very unfortunate. So let me just hide my webcam here. Okay, so like I said in the intro, or as I've shown in the intro, this is the button. We've already seen it, fortunately, this time around. But yeah, this is what I'm clicking sometimes when I'm hiding it with my webcam. So I'll probably have to redo the intro or whatever, but anyway. Okay, so now we want to add code to our JavaScript to tell it that it can copy our div here with, actually I don't need this for now. We want to be able to tell it that it can copy this div right here and append it to the end of this div, the elements container. So we want to have a copy of this div, this specific one, like right below this one here. So it would appear here. And so the way we're going to do this is when we handle the click here, we have an element listener, or sorry, so we have a central event handler like I showed before. So we check the target, we check its ID. If the ID is add one element button, which is the button you guys couldn't see earlier. Sorry about that. But I don't know if I want to move my webcam. Anyway, where is it? Here, yes. Add one element button. So this one has the plus sign for the button. So when you click on it, we want to call the code. So we're already calling the method add element to page. So let me just copy it in from my completed version. Over here, add element to page. So this method calls a lot of other methods, which we will have to bring in. All right, let's see what we're doing here. So the first thing we're doing is check button state to add element. I'll be adding this method shortly. We're basically determining if so when you try to add an element, we look at the button to make sure that it's not disabled. So because we'll be disabling the button once we've hit the maximum number of elements. So once we're at 6 elements in our case, we want to disable the button so that you can't keep adding more elements. And so the first thing we do is we check the button to see if it's disabled. So we check the class list. And if it is disabled, then we just return, we end the function immediately. And so you'll notice that whenever I'm doing a query selector, I always do an if to make sure that the element exists, just to make sure you don't get like a null reference or anything like that. So that's just a better coding practice in general, especially with JavaScript, where you want to make sure that the element exists before you proceed, right? Because what if you change the ID or whatever, this might not work anymore, and so you'll have to go fix that. What I didn't mention is that this method, it'll copy the div, add it to the page, and then we'll return the new ID of the element we've added. So the first element on the page, this one is like ID 0, and then the next one that we'll add will have an ID of 1. And I think we're going to be using that later for something else, so that's why we're doing it. So this is our result. We're starting it at -1. The div that we are copying is element div to copy, and we are copying into elements container. So the div to copy is this one, element div to copy, and we are copying into elements container. Whoops. And then we want to, so we have another check to make sure that you're not going over the maximum number of elements. So we have a method here, get maximum number of elements that can be added. Let me get that method or that function. It's right here. So if you recall, the maximum number of elements that we can add is stored in our C# code. It is in a constant in the competency class, max elements per competency. But we want to be able to tell our JavaScript what the maximum number of elements is, so that you can't just keep hitting the button over and over. So yeah, like I showed before, we set this in the page here with the max elements, and so this function just gets the maximum number of elements based on the div to copy. That's where we store it. So the maximum number of elements, we make a number based on the attribute, and if it isn't not a number, then we return that number. Otherwise, if anything goes wrong, we return 100 as the backup value. Yeah. I didn't want to hard code the 20 in there, or the 6. I just put a default fallback value, because you want to try to decouple things as much as possible, or only have a single place where you keep your constants. So I'm trying to keep it in the JavaScript. So we check the current number of elements that we have. Sorry. By doing this query selector, which looks very complicated. So the only thing we're doing here is we're counting all the element divs. An element div is something like this. An element div, it just contains the information about one element. However, we have this element div here that we start with in the page, but we also have this one here, which is always in the page. So we don't want to query this one here, basically, because we don't count it. Right now we have just one element. We don't want to say that we have 2 elements, because there's a hidden one in the page, right? So the way we do that is we're getting all of the element divs, but not element divs that are within our element div to copy. So we basically ignore the one that we're copying, because it doesn't count. So QSA returns an array, as we saw earlier. So we get the length of the array, and that tells us how many elements we currently have on the page. And if we currently have less elements than the maximum number of elements, then we are allowed to add the elements once again. So this is the real check. Checking the button state is a preliminary check. Yeah, and the result will be the current number of elements. So since it's 0 based, that's why that works. So when we're going to be adding the second element, the ID will be 1, because we had one element, and it's 0 based. So I think you can figure it out. I don't know how to explain it. It's just is the way it is, right? Okay, and now here's how we're actually appending the div to the page. We're doing div to copy into dot append, and then we're doing this here. So why do I have to do this? Why don't we just append the div to copy? So I can actually do that to show you guys what happens. So let me just append the div to div to copy, and I'll remove these function calls because they won't work. Okay. So okay, yeah. Let me go into the inspector. Let's get this here. All right. So this is the div we are trying to copy, currently hidden. When I hit this plus button, what we want is to copy this and append it to the page. When I hit this, our div is gone now. Oh, Renumbering almost crashed. Okay, it didn't. Annoying. Wait, I want to try again. It doesn't work. Okay, wait. Why does it not work? I thought this would work like once. Oh yeah. Okay. There we go. Oh, okay, because we copied the whole div. Not the children. Let me just actually change this real quick. We are appending the children. Oh, but I have to do this. Append can take a list of nodes, but I think I have to do this. All right. Let me try again. Hopefully this one works. Yeah, okay, that worked. But as you can see, it only works once. So I'm clicking the button again. Let me. So we were able to add one element to the page successfully. But now if I try to click the button again, nothing's happening. And that's because, like we've seen, we take our elements directly from the page. So we took the children of this element div to copy, and we appended them again to the page. But if you don't make a copy of them, which we've not done yet, then they will simply be moved from the element div to copy to the new location where we appended them. So they get removed, and we can't do it multiple times. So we'll have to fix that. This is a property of append, I think, or something like that. Okay, so let me give a brief explanation of how this works. So when you do a query selector in JavaScript, you are querying the actual element from the page. And if you hold that in a variable, your variable is that element. So any modifications you make to it are reflected on the page. So what that means is if we append the children of the div to copy, we are literally moving them from where they were to the new location, which is not what we want. We want to make a copy of that. And thankfully, JavaScript has a method to clone a node. So this is a node. A node is an HTML element, basically. So you can do clone node, which takes a parameter, whether you want a deep copy or not, or a shallow copy. And so that's what we want to do. We want to make a copy of all the nodes and then put it in the page. Like a copy of all the children. And so the reason we're not cloning the parent node is because we don't want to copy that one. We just want to copy its children. Because the div to copy is element div to copy, but it's like one div bigger than what we actually want. So element div to copy, we don't want to copy this div, we want to copy this one. So we want to copy its children. So here's what I came up with to clone all the descendants of this div. I'm calling the clone nodes method, which is from our utilities file. Let me just go there. Clone nodes receives an array of nodes, as well as the same boolean as before, whether we want a deep copy or not. And then, so we're starting by making an empty array, and we're making sure that our nodes are an array by like reassigning itself. And then we loop through each node, and then through our clone nodes, which is our empty array, we push a clone of the node by doing element.clone node, like I just showed, and then we pass it the parameter that we had of whether we want a deep copy, and then we return all those cloned nodes. And so when we do this, we're going to be cloning every child of that parent div that we want to copy, and then we will append it to the page. So we're appending the clone nodes, and we have to do this ... thing because that's what it expects, and this will work. So let's just see it in action. Let me just make sure I have the latest version. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and now I can't add anymore. So as you can see, we have our 6 elements, which is our limit that we've set as our constant. And so if I try to keep clicking the button, nothing is happening. So this works as intended. However, you'll quickly notice that they are numbered incorrectly. So we will be taking a look at that next to make sure that we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and not 1, 6, 6, 6, and so on. Or anything. So that's what we'll be doing next, probably. Or actually, no, we'll probably look at some of these other methods that this method is calling to add the element. But I want to show this. So yes, the label, this is a 6 here. And the ID of this one and the name, they're all 6s. So if I submit this, it'll actually just keep this first node, or this first element. The other ones will get discarded because it can't create an array with an index at 1 and then an index at 6. That just won't work. So we have to make sure that everything is numbered properly. But that's not what we will be doing now. We'll first look at this method here, check button state to add element. Let me copy it over. The reason I'm copying my code over is just I don't want to like rewrite it. It would take a lot of time, and there's no point. So let's just copy this, and this way also I make sure there's no errors in there, because if I did write it, I could make some errors. Anyway. Check button state to add element. What we're doing is we're looking at. Oh no, okay, this is something I wanted to change. Oh no, did I change it? Yes, I did actually. Okay. We are just making sure that if there's less than the maximum number of elements added to the page, the button is like enabled. And if you're at the maximum number of elements, then we disable it. So we check the div to copy. We get the maximum number of elements that can be added. So we call this other method from before. Yeah, this one. So that'll give us 6. We check the current number of elements again. I could probably make this a method, but it's fine, or a function. And then if the maximum has been reached, that means we either have the same number as the maximum or greater, which greater shouldn't happen, but just putting it as a safety measure. So then we're going to be calling toggle button to add element. Let me copy that over. So this is just going to disable the button once you've reached the maximum number of elements. Pretty simple method or function, sorry. I called it toggle. It's actually the wrong name. It's more like set state, because you pass it a Boolean parameter of whether you want to disable or enable the button. By default, we are disabling the button. So if you are disabling the button, we're adding the class list, or we're adding the class of disabled to the class list. And otherwise, we're just removing it. And so this is targeting this specific button here in the page that lets you add elements, so the plus. And we're also doing some other things here, like an error message. So am I? And some things with the tooltip. Tooltip you don't have to worry about. That's just some Bootstrap stuff. Just so that when you hover over the button, like the little text appears, you can look at Bootstrap for that. Error message. Hold on, I thought. Let me try this again. I don't exactly remember what. Okay, yeah. So we are setting this error message here. Oh, I think this is already in the page always, right? Oh yeah. So we have this field here. There can only be maximum elements at most. So we're saying you can only have 6 elements at most. I am so dumb, I'm hiding this. So here I am simply showing the error message that appears once you reach the maximum number of elements added. And then I reload the page and I'm doing it again to show that it gets displayed dynamically. And then later when we get to removing elements, we'll make this error message hide when we go below the maximum number of elements. And here to quickly show how we do this, this is fairly simple. We just have our error message in our variable, and then we modify its class list so we can add and remove a class based on whether or not we have reached the maximum number of elements. So this Boolean here, maximum elements, has been reached. And yeah, we either add or remove a class to make it hide or show. Okay, awesome. The other method we were calling, though, is renumber elements. And this one is one of the most important elements or functions. Let me copy it over. We're gonna need a lot of functions for this. So let me explain first what this is going to do. This is going to make sure that this number stays consistent. So this will be a 2, and then this will be 3, this will be 4, and then these here will all have also the correct IDs and things like that. So as you can see, we have quite a few attributes that we have to rename. So like the 4, the ID has the number, the name has the number. So anything that includes a number will have to be like renamed using string manipulations and all of that to make sure that we have the correct numbers. So if you don't feel super comfortable with your string manipulations, well, I have some functions to do this. It's not that bad, but actually this method is kind of big. Okay, well, I keep saying method. You know what I mean? It's a function. Because I'm not doing object-oriented JavaScript, I can't be bothered at the moment. Okay, let me just copy this. I don't know, copy it below here. Okay, renumber elements. We start with all the element divs, so same as before. We want every element div except the one that we copy from. And then if we do have anything, we will be going through every element div. So let me remind you guys what an element div is. It's one of these, right? So one of these, which includes a bunch of other divs, which include labels and text areas, and the button to delete the element, blah, blah, blah. So we're looping through every like parent div, and we're creating a new array, and we are pushing. Okay, yeah, that's right. That's right. Okay, okay. Let me explain what our goal here is. We want to make a 2D array of HTML elements, where so the first array, right, is an array. Well, I mean, it's an array of arrays. Every entry in that big array that I call it, the outer one, is an it's basically an array of all the elements of one element div. Okay, there we go. But we want that array to also include the element div itself. So let me just log it. It'll be much clearer. Maybe console.table actually might look better. I'm not sure. Not sure what that's gonna do. Let me log this. So we're gonna see what happens when I hit this. Yeah, I know it's not defined, but it's fine. Okay. Yeah, I guess. Okay, this one's pretty good. Let me pop the doc out of here so we can look at it. All right, we have a 2D array of HTML elements. So the first element in this array, in an individual array, is the div.element, or the div.element div, which was one of these. And so the way we got it in there is by pushing element divs at position 1, which is like the div itself. And then I set the element divs as the array itself, and then push more items in it. I just push all the children of the element div in it. Okay, this is code that I wrote a while ago. I mean, this is what it's doing. Like you can see the result. I don't exactly remember why I need this, or why I have to assign element divs to the array. It doesn't really matter how you get there. My goal was just to get here, to where you have a 2D array of HTML elements, where you have the container div as the first element, and then all of its children in the same array entry. And now we have 2 of these because we have 2 elements in the page. And the reason we want to have it in this format is because every number in this first row is going to be 0, which is its index in the big array. And then every number, like every ID, every name, everything is going to be 1. Except the title, except this here, this will have to be a 2, but we'll handle that case later because it's a special case. So yeah, okay, that's our goal. We have this big array now. Now we have the attributes array, which is basically all the attributes that we will have to loop through to rename. These are all the attributes that can contain a number, right? So we looked at that in the console. And we have this special one here, text value. That means the actual text of the node, but that case is handled separately. And so here we go. Now we're looping through our big array. And then, so we're doing like a nested for loop. So we're looping through the big array, and then we're looping through every array in that big array. And then when we get, when we get big array ij, that gives us an HTML element here, our current node. Now, finally, for our current node, we will loop through all of our attributes here, and then renumber them, like if the element has that attribute. So let current attribute equals attributes array k. Let's not look at the text value right now. Instead, let's do this case. So this is for every attribute that isn't the text value. Text value is not a real attribute, by the way. It's just, actually, I'll explain it later. Let's ignore it for now. So if our current element has the attribute, so for example, ID, if the element has an ID, then we set its attribute to B. So get attribute and set attribute, simple setters and getters for HTML elements to set their attributes. So set attribute takes two parameters. The first one is the name of the attribute. So this is the current attribute. Let's say this is ID, so this will be ID here. And then for the second parameter, we're doing some string interpolation with the backtick method. Get string before or after number. Let's get this method in here, this function. Get string before or after number. Okay. Then do I need another method? I'll need get number and string. Let me get it for now. Okay. Whoops. All right, let's start with get string before or after number. So let's look at the page here. Let me dock my window again. Put it here. And let me add an element. Okay. Oh well, okay, now it works because because the methods are there. But as you can see, so let's look at this attribute here. Elements to add _1 __ performance criteria. We want to be able to renumber this by just getting the first substring before the number, and then we want to get the substring also after the number, and then we'll just worry about the number based on our loop counter, or the index of our loop. So this is what this function does here. Get string before or after number. So you give it a string as a parameter, and you give it a parameter of whether you want to get the substring before the number or the substring after the number. I had two separate functions before, but I figured that I could be more efficient and do it in one. However, this for loop looks a bit weird. So we'll have a different starting index and an end index based on whether we are going in front of the number or behind the number. So if we want the substring before, then we're starting at 0, and we're going all the way to the end of the string, or otherwise we're doing the opposite. Sorry. If we're starting, our start index will be set to, if we want before the number, then we start at the front. But if we want everything after the string, then we start at the end of the string, so the length -1. And the end index will be either the length of the string, or it's -1 because of some +1 shenanigans. It's not 0, but don't worry about that. That's just what I found through trial and error, I believe. So now we want to loop. So So this is a for loop that can go two ways. Either we're going from here, from the start of the string to the end of the string, or we're going from the end of the string to the beginning of the string. So our I is start index, whatever that was set to. And then our end condition is the following. Either, or I mean the condition under which we continue looping is I is less than the end index, and we want the substring before the number, or I is still greater than the end index, and we don't want before, so we want the substring after. So either we're going from left to right or from right to left. That changes what our end condition is. And finally, either we'll be incrementing our string or decrementing it, or sorry, we'll either be incrementing the I or decrementing it. So plus equals 1 or minus 1 based on if you're going from left to right or right to left. Okay, awesome. Now, this loop will basically go over every character in your string, and as soon as it finds a number, it'll return the substring from either from the start to that point, if you were looking for the substring before, or it'll return the substring after the number to the end. So we can log this here. It'll be easier to understand. And so if we're checking if not is not a number, so if it is a number, when you do number string position I, so just the current character in the string that we're looping over. And okay, this end is extremely important here. And if the current character is not a space. And so the reason why we need to avoid spaces, even though, if you look here, there's no spaces in any of these attributes. Sorry. When we're going to be modifying the actual text, I'm so stupid. When we're going to be modifying the actual text, there are spaces in this. But what's the issue with a space? A space is not a number, right? That doesn't matter. Well, you would be incorrect in thinking that, because in JavaScript, if you do a number space, you would expect it to give you not a number, right? It's a space. What else would it be? But in fact, in JavaScript, this is equal. I'm hitting every key on my keyboard. This is equal to 0. I'm not making this up. You can test it for yourself. Maybe they'll change that in the future, but at the moment, that's what you get when you do number and you pass it the string of a space. So we want to make sure that this is not the case here, because we don't consider that a number. All right. Anyway, now we'll get a substring either in front of the number or behind the number, and if that didn't work, we return an empty string. Okay. Whew. That's a complicated function, but it is very important to getting this working. And then if we look at the console here, so you can see elements to add. So this was like, elements to add in front of the 0, and then after that we have the title. So let me actually get this here. So this would be on the label, I believe, elements to add, and then the other substring is title. So anyway, you get the front of the string, the end of the string, without the number, and then you can just now replace the number with whatever you want. And the reason I did it that way, I think you could simplify this by assuming that the number only takes up one character. The issue with that is, what if you get to the index 10? Now your number takes up 2 characters. So that's why by going from left to right and from right to left, you make sure to avoid any issues. The number could be 10 characters long, and this would still work. But I should note, or it should be noted, that this only works with numbers, or wait, sorry, with one number in the string. And I did specify that, like in my function. It only works. Where do I talk about that? Oh yeah, get number in string. I guess I should specify. Yeah, it only works if there's one number. So if you have like nested elements or nested objects, let's say an element had another object as part of it that we were creating with this form, and then you had to index another object. Like you'll need to make your own functions here for the string manipulation, but it should be the same idea as this. It just might have to be more fancy. But this was perfect for my needs, so that's what I have. But just so you're aware. And then okay, so let's go back here. So look at this back to here. What we're doing, we're getting the string before or after the number. So we're setting the new attribute value to be the previous attribute value, the front of the string before the number. So get string before or after number, get attribute, and then by default we assume that we are getting the front of the string, so I don't pass a second parameter here. Then we put the number itself, which number is I, which if you remember, I is our indexer for our big array, and our big array is an array of arrays where every array in the big array, sorry, I'm kind of joking here, but every array in the outer array, its index basically corresponds to the position of it corresponds to the number that we want to assign to all of the elements inside. There we go. Okay, that was complicated. And then we also, so that will give us elements to add underscore 1, and then we need the end of it. So then we should do get string before or after number, and then we get the end of the string, so we pass false. And that will reassign, or that will reassign every attribute to be the correct value. Whew. Okay. Very complicated step, but it is, I cannot stress this enough, it is like the most important because it makes sure that your array can be created by MVC.net. It ensures that your labels are linked to your fields, so you get that accessibility, and it will make sure that the numbers are correct. Now, speaking of which, let's talk about this number here in the text. This is done here. If the current attribute is text value, so then we'll call this method here get number in string. This one is pretty simple. Once again, we get a string, and then we are going to be starting from left to right and from right to left. We're going to be checking. Oh yes, okay, no, sorry. We do two loops here. We start from left to right, and we check every character individually. And as soon as we find one that is a number, we set this as our starting index, and then we loop from right to left. Once again, in our string, checking every character, and as soon as we find one that's a number, that's our end index. So you can imagine it as, two pointers moving closer to each other in a string until what you're left with should be a number in the middle. So if you have a string and in it you have 1, 2, 3, your starting index will be set at the index of the position that has the 1, and then your end index will be set to the index that has the 3 at its position. And if everything in between those two indices is a number, that means that you've found a number in the string. So once again, this only works when you have a single number in the string, so you might have to make this fancier for your needs, but this is fine for me. So loop from left to right, set the start index, loop from right to left, set the start index, and then if you have a number between the start and the end index, if you make a substring between the start and the end, and you turn that substring into a number, if that's actually a number, then return it. And so that's how we get the number in the string, because we want to do the same thing as we did before. You know, we want to keep the front of the string, set our number, and then get the end of the string. So if the current attribute is text value, that means that we're checking the text content of the node, but we're making sure that the text content of the node actually does have a number. So get number in string will return -1 if there's no number. So if it's not equal to -1, and finally our current node does have the attribute of text value, because we don't want to be renaming every node's text value. We only want to be doing it for the ones that have the attribute of text value, which basically tells our code, okay, there's a number in this string. Could you modify it so that it stays like in sync? So that's what we're doing. If that's the case, then we set the text content to be the front of the string, our new number, which is +1, because humans don't read zero-based, and so that makes sure that this number, this new number here, is a 2 instead of a 1, which it would be otherwise. And then we set the end of the string, so everything that comes after that. And we've ignored the space as being a number, which I had an issue with that before when I came to this, and then like this space here would be considered a number, and so that would throw everything off. But yes, anyway. And so now we have officially added a new element to the page and renumbered everything so that it stays in sync, which is fantastic. And then was there anything else after that? Let me just remove these console logs. So then the last thing we do, okay, yeah, tooltips. Once again, that's not useful. That doesn't apply in every case. It's just for this project specifically. Oh yeah, also after we've added an element, now we have to check, have we reached the maximum? So we check if we reach the maximum before adding the element and after adding the element, because at this point we might have to disable the elements, or disable the button that lets us add more elements, and we might have to display the error message. So we do it before and after. Awesome. And then we do refresh validators. I'll be talking about that later, I believe. I think I'll finish off with that because that's the final problem I had to solve with this. Yeah. Okay, so the next part will be removing elements. But now that we have the code in place to renumber everything, this should go pretty well here. Okay, so when removing fields, the bigger issue usually is just making sure that everything stays numbered properly. Because when you add new elements, if you could have a way to just set the number to be the next available number by counting how many elements you had in the page and then setting it to +1 of that, or setting it to that since it's zero-based, etc., etc. But you'll have some issues when you remove elements, and now you have like a hole in your numbering because you had 1, 2, 3, 4, and now you remove number 3, and you have 1, 2, 4. But since we have this method that lets us renumber elements and attributes and all of that, we won't really have any issues when removing elements. The only special case is the first element in the page, which we always want to be there because we make it required that you have at least one element. So if you notice here, it says empty this element rather than remove. So our goal will be to have it so that when you click on this, it'll just set these to be empty. However, these we will actually remove. So this one says remove this element, this one says empty. And yeah, right now remove element is not defined. So let's create that method, that function. You know what I mean. Let me find it first. So remove element. Okay, I'm just kind of pasting these functions in whatever order, it doesn't really matter. All right, remove element. So this gets called, okay, yeah, I should explain this first. Whenever you click on something, I check if there is a parent button. So what that means is, remember that method from earlier, find nearest parent of type? So from wherever you clicked, bubble up until you find a button. And if you do find a parent button, then this will not be set to null. Otherwise, this just returns null. So if you do have a parent button, then check its class list and check if it contains the class of button remove element, which is a class on these buttons. Button remove element, and then we will remove it if, and then that tells our code, sorry, that we will want to remove this element. Remove element, and then we give it the button. The reason I had to do this is simply because, why not just check if you clicked on the button? Because I had to add a span inside the button, and so if you click on the span, it wouldn't click on the button instead. It would click on the span. So my target here in the JavaScript was the span, which did not have the class of button remove element. But so that's why I bubble up until I find the parent button. So anyway, that's what we're doing here. We call remove element. We pass it the button because the button has an attribute which will tell us which element we are trying to remove. So if we look here, target. So we gave it a target attribute of element -0. And if we add another element here, it gets once again, it gets renumbered automatically because we have the code set up for it. So its target is element 1. And so all that means is we want to remove the element with the ID of 1 from the page, which is going to be the second one because we're sticking to 0 based. Okay. So if our button has the attribute of target, then we get the number in the string from the target. So once again, we're reusing our methods here, our functions. If the div number is not equal to -1, that means that there was a number in the target. Then we find the div to remove, which is going to be, to find that we make a query selector where, okay, this is syntax you might not have seen before. When you do a query selector, you can use square brackets to query based on the attribute. So what this means is we are trying to find an element that has the attribute of element div number and the value of our div number that we have. Let's go back in the page here. Let's look at this parent div, element div. It has this attribute here of element div number that gets renumbered automatically because we set that attribute as part of our attributes array from earlier. And so element div number, this is just like every div has that. Every element div has that. Just so we can easily target, just so that we can easily target this div. And then this is our div to remove. If it exists, then then we first have this special case. If the div number is 0, that means this is the first div in the page. We don't want to remove that one. As I said, we want to empty it. And so from that div, we get the title input and the performance criteria input, which are the text areas. So we do a query selector inside the div to remove, and then we get the name. Oh, this one's kind of cool. Star equals, or sorry, $ equals means find me the element, or the first element, that has a name that ends in .title, because I didn't want to put the number in there. I was just lazy. We know what the number is. It's going to be number 0, like the ID is going to be 0. But I felt like this was just cooler, and it was a cool use of this. So yeah, we get the first input. We get the first element with a name that matches this. So this is like a fuzzy select in query selector. Like we're querying a substring, right? Same thing with the performance criteria input. And so if they both exist, so we make sure that they exist before moving on. If they do exist, then we set the value to be empty for both of these. So that'll just empty them. And then we resize the text areas to make sure that they're the correct height. So if you had like 10 lines in your performance criteria, and then you empty the element, you don't want it to stay at this height. You want to shrink it down. So that's why we resize text area for both of these. And so that's the case. That's in the case where we clicked on the first element, or we clicked on the remove button for the first element. But if you click on it for any other element, then we simply remove the div, and then we remove the tooltip. Ignore that once again. And then we renumber elements, but we only have to do it if we actually removed an element. We don't have to do it in every case. And then lastly, check the button state to add elements, because now that we removed an element, we should be able to add another one. And so we set the state properly. Or we call the method to check it and handle it. And that's everything you need. So now we can successfully add as many elements as we want, remove them. I'll give this example. I'll hide my webcam. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm simply showing that I'm starting with the maximum number of elements, so we can see the error message at the bottom there. And then I'm just filling up these elements and then removing them. And as you can see, the error message disappears because it realizes that we are no longer at the maximum number of elements. And then we can add it again, and we see the error message. So it does all the checks in real time. And then I also give an example of resizing the text area after emptying the element to make sure that it gets resized properly. And lastly, I explain that you could have it to where you can actually delete the first element, and instead you have a check to make sure that you just always keep one element in place. But that's not what I did. I instead did that you can't delete the first one, you simply empty it, but you can delete the others. And so I explained that decision that I made that you could do differently if you wanted. That's what I went with. But yeah, so now we have, we're nearly done here. This will mostly work. However, actually, okay, let me comment out a method call, function call to refresh validators, because we don't want to be calling this right now. Not yet, at least. So that I can show you guys the issue. When I try to submit this competency, I get all these error messages here that say that the fields are required. And that's all well and good. But sorry, when I try to submit this, see, let me hit though, and this is the interesting part, even though it has the correct attributes like data val max length, data val required, all of that. It has all the error messages in place, but it's just that when we created the page in the first place, these elements were not part of it, and so when the inline JavaScript validators got set, those elements weren't part of it, and so they are not part of the validation. So the inline or the real-time validation is done using jQuery, which is why you await this section here, render partial async validation scripts partial. That just calls some jQuery code to actually make it so that you have inline validation in real time. So if this is empty, it'll complain, but as soon as you start typing, it goes away. I think it's pretty cool. But now we want to have that on our new fields that we created. So let's do that. This is done by calling refresh validators, which is just a function from my utilities. We pass it a form selector, which is a query selector string. That's how we're gonna get the form. And this is jQuery here, so we have to call some jQuery code. This is not a function that I wrote myself. I took this online. I think I just modified it to make it follow our coding standards. So our target form is the form in which we want to reapply all our data annotations and all that, all our validation. So you remove data, you remove attribute, no validate, and then you parse it again. You just parse the form. So it's pretty simple. This syntax might change in the future depending on your .NET version. Like this is .NET 6 right now, and so it uses a certain version of jQuery, which might change in the future. But I'm sure you can look at Stack Overflow and get some help. Hopefully, I mean, that's where I found this. And now when we call this, let me check refresh, and let me hide my webcam. So here I am showing that we can add a new element, and then if we try to submit the form without filling it, well, without entering the title or the performance criteria, which are both required, they give us error messages like they apply to the original element from the page that we copied. So that's good. That now means that any fields that we add to the page will have their validation done properly using whatever validators we added or the data annotations that we add to our classes, which is fantastic. Pretty cool. We don't have many issues left. So now what's mostly left is just handling loading our page after having posted multiple objects. Let's do that next. So the issue is our page, like let's say you post your form with 5 elements added, and then like previously you get an error, and so you have to load the page again. We have no loop here to tell the page to put all our elements in the page. So it's thankfully not super complicated. It's not my cleanest code. I think you can definitely clean this up. But yeah, here's what I did. Here we go. I think I replaced this, right? Yeah, okay. I'll have to restart this. Let me explain this code here. So we have the same thing as before. This is what we had before, just element div number 0. So this isn't an else clause, which gets called if you had no elements already added. And if you remember from earlier, we have elements already added set to true when you load the page after having submitted the form, and you have now an elements to add in your as an array. So this would be set to true. So if it's set to false, that means that this is your first time loading the page, and so you start with your one element in the page. Okay, so that's the same as before, but else, then you did already have an element added, at which point we're going to be counting how many elements we're adding. So we start an element counter at 0, and for each element in model.elements to add, okay, yeah, this is where we do this. Okay, sorry. We loop through every element, and then we give it a div at the position element counter. So the first one will be starting at 0, and then 1, 2, 3, depending on how many you had added. The first one, and then I add a class optionally if it's the first one or not super complicated. Oh yeah, so the first element says remove this element, or sorry, the first button, like the first X button, says empty this element. All the other ones say remove. So we get that with this. So overall, it's pretty straightforward. It's just a loop. But this if statement is important here. So if you recall from earlier, we make it so that if you had posted something, then when we get to this step, your model.elements to add will always be an array of the size of the maximum number of elements that you allow. That's because we want to make sure that this final element here can load properly and be indexed properly, and so that you won't crash. But as a result of that, you can't just loop through every element in model.elements to add without doing any checks, because then as soon as you post something, you'll always load the page with, and then you'll reload the page with like 6 elements because that's our maximum. But we only want to actually display the element if it's not empty, which means that the element.title is not null or white space, and the performance criteria is not null or white space. So if that's the case, then we can display it. And that's it. So in the end, we have this element div duplicated 3 times in the page, which is not ideal. I think you could probably combine this, make it part of the original if or something. I'm not sure. But since it's all in the same view, and it's not too much HTML, I would say it's still not the end of the world, but you might want to make this better. Like if your elements that you're copying are more complicated, then you might want to look into something like a partial view potentially. Yeah. Anyway, so now let's give an example of this. I'll be submitting a form with let's say 6 elements. Oh, actually, I just realized. I think I just found a bug actually. Interesting. Let's see how this works here. So I'm gonna add 6 elements, and then to be able to submit the form, everything has to be filled in. This it must be 4 characters long. All right, whatever. And since we don't have a program selected, we'll get an error. But this should work here. We should get the page again with all our elements. Perfect. However, yes, like I thought, when we first load the page, it doesn't actually check if it should display the error message or not. I think it's probably easiest if I do that in JavaScript. I just realized I completely forgot to do that. So in competency.js, after the window loaded, let's just do check button state to add elements. This should fix it. So let me control F5 to reload the page. And if we look here, wait, did it do it? Wait, hold up, let me post this. Yes. Okay. So as you can see, when you load the page, you now have the error message. Once again, I am class. You might want to call a function like this at the beginning or when your page loads to make sure that things are in the correct state. Or we could do that as well in our CSHTML. We could make sure that we display the error message if we had already the maximum number of elements added, so on and so forth. Okay. I think that the final thing that I personally did in our project, and that I think could be useful, it's not super complicated, but I'll just share it with you guys, is when you attempt to submit the form, if there's any fields that are just empty, or any pairs of elements that are empty, or no, not pair of elements, if you have any element whose title and performance criteria is empty, there you go. You might want to remove them because they would just give an error, right? They would just give you 2 errors. So what I did is I ended up removing any pair that was empty. But if one of the fields is not empty, then you don't remove that element because they started to fill it out, they just didn't complete. And so at that point, you do want to tell them that they have an error. But if they're both empty or like white space, then I think I removed them. Hold on, when did I call? Oh yeah, I remember. Okay. Okay, sorry, I was lost in thoughts there. All right, so let's get this method, this function. It's pretty simple. When I believe it's when we click on the button to submit the form, we call. Oh yeah. Remove empty fields in form. Whoops. So you might expect this function to be called when we submit the form, but interestingly, in JavaScript, the form submit event only gets sent or only gets created if the form is going to be successfully created. I think because of jQuery, if you have some errors, the form submit event just doesn't get fired if you have errors. But we want to remove the empty fields in the form regardless of if there's errors or not. So we actually do it on click rather than on submit. That's, yeah, it's a bit counterintuitive, but it works fine. Let me grab the function here. So remove empty fields in form. So what we are doing here is we get all the element divs, and then we loop through them. We get their title and their performance criteria input. If they both exist, and if their trimmed values are both empty, so that means if they're both like white space or they're empty, then we actually remove the whole div. And when you call remove element, it'll renumber them. So it'll make sure everything stays in order. And then we check the button state. Actually, this call is useless because after you call remove element, it checks the button state, but it's fine. So let me make an example here. I'll put just some white space in this one, just to show that it will still work. So the event listener checks for this button specifically when it gets clicked, and when it is clicked, it gets removed. So we were able to successfully submit the form since we had no errors left, and then we loaded the page again because we had no program selected. I think that's nearly everything. Let me just, okay. I think that one final thing I want to show you guys is some server-side validation. with custom validation, because this is some other things that I've learned that weren't explicitly told in class, I believe. Actually, let me go back here to competency class. So something that we have added is a maximum elements. This is just a custom validation attribute, and then we pass to it a max elements per competency, which is just, you know, our constant here. If we go look in our custom validation, we have here maximum elements. And the reason I want to talk about this custom validation is because it applies to the whole array. If you look here, maximum elements is applied on the elements to add as a whole. So I just wanted to kind of show off how this works. So if the value is null, then we return success. But then we make variable elements by taking our value and just casting it to an I enumerable of elements. And if the count is greater than the max size, which the max size is just whatever is passed to our custom validation, then that's incorrect because we have too many elements. So if I put a breakpoint here, when we call this, oh my gosh, that's so annoying. I don't know, I couldn't handle my breakpoint, I guess. Let me start over. So we'll see what elements is set to, but it'll be an I enumerable of elements to add. I don't know if it'll do an array or not specifically. Let's do this. I'll do like 3. So elements is, oh, it is an array. So we get our elements here. So you have full control over this. Like if I had some other things to check, I could do this with a custom validation as well, because I get like the full array of elements, and then I can apply any validation that I need on them. But yeah, that was just a way to ensure that you couldn't post more elements than is allowed. Even if the page, like the JavaScript, prevents you from adding more elements, like you should still have server-side validation to really like set that in place. Okay. Was there anything else? I think this is pretty good. So something I don't talk about in this tutorial is how to do edit. This is only create, but edit should be fairly straightforward, like to load the page, because like your code is ready to receive an empty object like a null model, and it's also ready to receive an object that's been posted to the server, which is what you'll get when you actually load the page. Now, so the only thing you'll have to do is like let's say when I actually save this object to the database, we don't keep the models, the elements to add. We keep the actual I collection of elements. So in the code to add the elements to the database and add the competency, let me go here. It's separated across 2 projects, but it doesn't really matter. I should have been ready for this. It's fine. So I think it's create. Oh yeah, create competency. So when we create the competency, we set the elements to be the elements to add, and then we get rid of or no, we don't get rid of the elements to add, but we could get rid of them, but we just don't need them. So if you were doing edit, you would have to take the elements of the object and set that as the elements to add, and then your page would be able to loop through them correctly. The only special thing with edit that I can foresee, because I haven't done it yet, because there's some business rules that we have to discuss. the issue you might encounter is like removing elements that have already been added. You have to make sure that referential integrity is kept in place. So maybe there's certain elements that you can't remove because there's other references to them, things like that. So just keep that in mind. However, for the basic HTML and JavaScript structure in CS/HTML should be the same. You just might need more rules in place to handle the rest. But I mean, of course, edit is important. But I think that this you should have plenty of information to know how to create it at this point. Yeah, so I'll think about if there's anything else. I'll come back in a minute. Otherwise, this should be the end of this tutorial. Okay, so I have looked at my final product, and I believe that we've covered everything. If there's anything, I guess I'll add it to the description or something. So for now, I won't be sharing this code until I ask the teachers to know if it's okay to do that, because they might not want me to share the code directly to students who could potentially use this. So I'll just get their approval first or not, because I mean this could be directly used in certain projects, I believe, or I mean pretty closely, at least for the JavaScript. So I mean obviously you can copy the code from the video itself, but it's more work that way, right? So I'll just get the approval first. But other than that, this was my tutorial on how to create multiple objects from a form using JavaScript and .NET MVC, .NET Core 6.0. I hope that you found this useful and that you can use this in your own projects. If there's any questions, you can ask them in the comments down below, and I'll try to reply. I don't know if I'll be getting comments on this in like years and how much knowledge I'll have of this still in the future, but I'll try my best to provide help if needed. So yeah, as I said, I don't have plans for more tutorials like this in the future, but I felt like this one shared a lot of my knowledge and a lot of the tricks that I've learned over the past year, which should hopefully help you guys in your own projects. And that was the intent of this. So thank you very much for listening, and I will see you guys later. Bye.